Hello again. We continue in our series devoted to our commentary and reflection on the dialogues of Plato, and today we're going to talk about a pretty short one, which is the Ion. So this is not a very big dialogue, probably not one of the most famous of Plato's dialogues, but it's very significant regardless for some of the things that it talks about. So let's just jump into it. Let's start with an introduction of some aspects that will be dealt with in the dialogue. So basically, we only have two people in this Platonic dialogue. There is Socrates and there is Ion of Ephesus, who is a rhapsode. So the first thing we should be doing is explaining to our modern audience what a rhapsode is. So this requires a little bit of exploring. So in very remote ancient Greece, before the historical period, there was a tradition of oral formulaic poetry. Like many peoples all over the world, the Greeks, before the development of writing, had an oral poetic tradition, mostly epic. There were poems about great mythical episodes of the past, partly fictional and partly real. In the case of Greece, these great cycles, these great topics were the Trojan cycle, about the Trojan War and the return of the Trojan War's heroes after the destruction of the city. There was the Theban cycle, for example, which described the two first unsuccessful and then successful sieges of Thebes in Boeotia. There were cycles devoted to the Argonauts, Jason and the Argonauts exploring the Black Sea and getting the Golden Fleece. There were also cycles about the hunt of the War of Calydon, cycles related to heroes and their deeds. For example, there would have been cycles devoted to Heracles and Theseus, and probably some others that have been lost completely or have only survived through very fragmentary recensions. Now, these epic cycles, they gave the subject matter for poems. But at this time, remember, we're talking about probably the 9th, 8th century BC. At this time, writing had not appeared or was in the verge of appearing. We're talking of oral societies, and the poets that lived in these societies and that composed poetry basically followed this pattern. So they were restricted by the subject matter. Everybody knew the legends and the stories of the epic cycles. So you couldn't you couldn't deviate massively from said stories. There was a certain metrical series of rules for composing a poem, but these poets, with those constraints, were relatively free to compose, as I said, in an oral formulaic way, to compose variations, to compose stagings of a fragment of the cycle for a sitting. So how would this go? Well, the poet gets to a village and he's going to be reciting for maybe an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. That's not enough time to recite maybe all the adventures of a whole cycle, like maybe the Trojan War, but he might sing about some specific episodes, maybe the ones that the audience likes the most, that specific audience, and that they ask him to recite. So maybe if he's reciting in a place that has ancestors who were heroes who fought at the Trojan War, the poet will recite episodes related to those specific heroes, those local heroes. And as I said, the poet is pretty restricted in subject matter, but he has some leeway for improvising minor details because there is no written text. There is like no fixed, definite version of, let's say, the Iliad or the Odyssey, which means the poet gets, a lot of leeway at the time of improvising and modifying minor aspects of the poem. And, this is a performative art. The poet can see if the audience is reacting positively, if the audience maybe like a little bit more of color and description, or if they prefer maybe more descriptive focus on battles or on sad things. So, this was a performative art. And it has been alive, even though it might surprise you. As late as the 20th century, oral formulaic poetry traditions have survived in different parts of the globe. In Europe, for example, in Serbia, where the cycles related to the Battle of Kosovo were, as I said, still being recited in the early 20th century when they were studied by two anthropologists, Milman and Parry, who are the ones that coined the whole concept of the oral formulaic tradition. Anyway, the next step is, so the first step is ancient Greece before the historical period. You have, like in other parts of the world, these poets, part of an oral formulaic tradition, who have this epic material and they improvise stagings, recitations of segments, of fragments of this tradition. But things change. We move down to the 5th century BC, classical era Greece. So the first thing is the Homeric texts, the Homeric poems get fixed. So now there is a written version of the Iliad, a written version of the Odyssey. These two written versions acquire mythical, religious prestige and status. You know, for the ancient Greeks, the Homeric texts were like the Bible is for Western Christianity. So they were not only aesthetically appreciated texts, they were religious texts. So the poets of the old oral formulaic tradition do not completely disappear, but they transmute into something else. They become just reciters. Those are rhapsodes, and those are the rhapsodes we encounter in this dialogue. And that's what Ion is doing for a living. So a rhapsode, it's very important, does not create the poem. That is, the poem is already given. It's in fixed and written form. The rhapsode is a performer. So the rhapsode memorizes some poems. In the case of Ion, he's a specialist on Homer, so he would have learned by heart the Iliad, the Odyssey, and perhaps some other poems attributed to Homer that have been lost. And he would have been a performer, you know, he would have been good. So as an actor-like figure, he would have recited those verses with all the rhetorical tricks of putting emotion, intonation, of putting feeling into the performance. So to make the audience enjoy the spectacle. But it's interesting, as I said, to emphasize that the rhapsode does not create. The rhapsode just recites a poem. So he is not a poet himself. So Ion is the protagonist or co-protagonist of this dialogue. What is the topic? So this is an early Platonic dialogue, so one that fits more or less within the type of the so-called Socratic dialogues. In all of these dialogues, you have Socrates encountering a person or a bunch of people who are presumed to be experts on some area of knowledge, or maybe it might be military prowess or temperance, or some other area of expertise. Socrates starts a dialogue with these people by asking them to define some abstract concept of which they are supposed to be experts. And then through the Socratic dialogue, through the elenchos, we get, Socrates gets these presumed experts to contradict themselves and to say things that do not appear reasonable and that deviate from the initial definitions and premises that were made. And generally these dialogues end in an aporia. That is, Socrates has gotten these persons to contradict themselves, but he does not generally propose a definition of the abstract concept or moral concept that was explored in the dialogue. So this one would be one of them. In most of these early Platonic dialogues, you can summarize them in one word, which is the philosophical, moral, ethical concept that is being explored. So, for example, in the Charmides, it's sophrosine, temperance is the thing that is being discussed. In the Euthyphro, it's piety, yeah, hosios. In this case, what is being doesn't perfectly match the pattern, but the topic of this dialogue, the concept that is being discussed, is poetry, but more specifically, a dichotomy. Is poetry an art, or is poetry a sort of divine inspiration? Now, this is very interesting, and this dialogue serves as a poster piece to Plato's famous antagonistic attitude towards poetry. Now, Plato was very hostile to poetry. It can be seen, for example, in many of his texts. The one that is usually quoted is the Republic, where he famously expels poets from the ideal city. But it can also be seen in even earlier texts. I would say in the Apology of Socrates, we get, in a couple of sentences, in a nutshell, the same idea that is developed here in the Ion, the idea that poets are crafters of lies and basically have no intellectual merit of their own, because it's not that they are wise and intelligent men, anything good or wise that they say in their poetry is divinely inspired. So poets are just vessels for this divine inspiration, in the same way that diviners and oracles are just instruments of the divine, and so therefore they're not by themselves intelligent or smart or meritorious, and shouldn't be taken seriously at the time of governing a city, or of dialoguing and finding rational solutions to issues and problems. So, very hostile Plato to poets, and there is a paradoxical element in this. We know that Plato, when he started writing, wrote some plays, which have disappeared. The format of the Platonic dialogues is very clearly inspired on classical Athenian tragedy. That is, before Plato, philosophy was basically written in treatises, in essays. So, and it's Plato who really adapts the theatrical form of the dialogue for his plays, for his philosophical works. And again, this might be inspired in his imitating, trying to reflect on paper, the vividness and the spontaneity of his mentor Socrates' dialogues and conversations in the streets of Athens. But there's also an influence from the theatre there, I suspect. Anyway, so Plato here follows his line. His main line will be saying that poetry is, in the best of cases, it's a divine gift. So poets as such are not to be appreciated particularly well. In fact, they are also like imitators of things, or the creators of lies, and imitators of things that are not necessarily real. So imitators of the imitated stuff, and that also, disqualifies them and puts them in a position not dissimilar to that of other artists and imitators. Okay, so finally, before we just jump into the meat of the dialogue itself, I would like to comment on a few of the unusual characteristics of the Ion. First of all, it's very short. I think it's the shortest of all the Platonic dialogues. In my edition, it's about 11, 12 pages long. Another curiosity is that even though it's an early Platonic dialogue, as I've said, there isn't really a moral or philosophical concept that is being explored. I mean, there is this debate on the nature of poetry. As I said, if poetry is an art, if poetry is a form of knowledge that is discovered by the poet or the rhapsode, versus poetry being, just a sort of divine madness. But that's not really a philosophical concept. And also Socrates is pretty pushy. I mean, it's pretty clear in this dialogue that Socrates has this view that poetry is divine madness, and he keeps cajoling and pushing Ion towards an acceptance of this point of view, which again, it's not the typical thing we would expect in a Socratic dialogue. In those early Socratic dialogues, Socrates is very careful to avoid pushing his own views on any matter. He just, lets people talk and lets them lead themselves into aporias, into contradictions, but is never willing to say, no, well, my idea is that the definition of such and such is this. So yeah, both those things make it a bit unusual for an early Platonic dialogue. Okay, so let's take a look at the dialogue then. So at the beginning, in the first lines, we get Ion appearing in Athens, and he has a short conversation with Socrates, in which Socrates rather flatters him. Ion has just won the first prize in a festival to Asclepius in Epidaurus, and Socrates flatters him a bit, saying, it's you rhapsodes have a really cushy job. You get to look good because when you perform, you have to, put nice clothes and look good, and also you understand and interpret Homer's thought, and Homer being one of the most prestigious writers, so this is a very nice thing for someone to do and to be. A knower of the wise, a knower and an interpreter of the thoughts of the greatest of Greek figures. So here there is already something at play. Socrates, and he's going to do this all through the dialogue, is conflating two things which are not necessarily the same. He is conflating an expertise on a poet or on poems with expertise on the topics covered by these poems or by this poet. And that's something that he's going to use all through the dialogue to take a dig at Ion, at rhapsodes, and at poetry. But let's jump back a little bit. So, after praising Ion as a great rhapsode, they start conversing, and Socrates asks him if, if he knows, if his expertise is, restricted to one figure or to other people. Ion says he's an expert on Homer. He doesn't know about other poets. So he knows everything there is to know, and he is the wisest at interpreting the Homeric poems and at reciting them, but about other poets he doesn't know. So Socrates starts teasing him and contradicting him. Socrates' main argument is basically, he says, you cannot be an expert in Homer and at the same time not be an expert in other poets. And the case he makes is, if you are an expert in any area of knowledge, you will distinguish the good and the bad practitioners and the good and the bad works in that area of knowledge, in that area of expertise. If you have techne, you should be able to distinguish who in a field are good and who in a field are bad, which means you cannot just be an expert in Homer. If Homer is taken by Ion to be the best of poets, and if Ion is an expert in Homer, he should be able to understand and to and to explain why other poets who are less good than Homer are less good than Homer. Which again, that contradicts one of Ion's first statements, that he only knows about Homer, he doesn't know about other poets. So Socrates kind of pulls him to having to more or less accept that if he really knows about Homer, he has to know about other poets. In fact, the case that Socrates makes is that the only plausible explanation of Ion knowing about everything that needs to be known about Homer and his poems, but not about other poets, is that he really has no real knowledge of poetry in this case. Rather, he has divine inspiration. So this was a very classical idea among the Greeks and among other peoples, that poets were inspired by the gods, particularly the muses, and that they were more or less dictated to, and they composed their poems. So that's Socrates' take. He says, you know about Homer because the gods possess you, a little bit like in shamanism or in voodoo or in Santeria. The divine creature possesses and speaks through the mouth of the poet. The metaphor, and Socrates uses a metaphor, which is the metaphor of the magnet. And he says, there is this chain. First there's the god inspires the poet inspires the rhapsode inspires the audience, and they form a chain, a magnetic chain, where the god, through all these intermediaries, gets to affect the masses. Okay, Ion isn't too happy with this idea of being, just an instrument of the gods and of being an ignorant, know nothing. So he protests about this. So the Socrates goes back on the attack again. So they first start talking about performance, and here they explore something very interesting, which is the power of a theatrical or a poetic performance to move the audience and to move the poet himself. Now, this is an interesting topic even for modern literature, and Shakespeare very famously explored it in Hamlet when after having heard the actors make a speech about Hecuba, Hamlet has this famous soliloquy of how can one be moved to tears, based on just what some actors are singing about a person who never existed. And the power of fiction to move us. Yeah. But anyway, going back to the Ion, the way in which Socrates uses this magical, seductive, moving appeal of poetry, both to the audience and to the poet himself, is through this argument of divine inspiration. Ion feels outside of himself while delivering his recitation, and he produces the same effect in his audience. And the argument that Socrates is making is that what is happening here, this madness of crying for somebody who is not a relative of yours, who you don't know of, who might be a fictional character and never have existed. This incredible power of fiction and of arousing emotions in other humans. This can only be explained through this divine possession and this transmission from the god to the masses. Ion denies being possessed and mad, because the image that is, the equivalent image that appears here is that of the prophet, of the seer, and Ion does not agree with this. So Socrates attacks again, and he uses part of the arguments that he already used in the first part of the dialogue. So he basically insists that, only experts can speak well of their areas of expertise. And that was already discussed in the first area, like if for example you are a doctor, you are the most qualified person to talk about medicine. A rhapsode wouldn't be the best person to talk about medicine; it would be a doctor, and a charioteer would be the best person to talk about chariots, not a rhapsode. And what Socrates does here is he insists on taking examples of the content of the Homeric poems. And he says, Homer sometimes talks about charioteering. So this is part of the technical knowledge. Ion says, I know everything about the Homeric poems. I know everything there is to know, and I'm the best expert. So Socrates says, okay, some parts of the Homeric poems talk about charioteering. Are you an expert, more than a charioteer, about charioteering? And Ion has to say, no, I'm not. Some parts of the Homeric poems talk about fishing. Do you know more about fishing than a fisherman? And Ion has to say, well, no. Some parts of the Homeric poems are about divination. You are not a diviner. Do you know more than a diviner about divination? No. So what Socrates is hammering in is that if there is an expert in the Homeric poems, what is he an expert in? Now, he is not an expert in any of the specific areas of knowledge that might be touched upon on a Homeric poem, like warfare or charioteering or prophecy or other thing. Of course, from the modern perspective, we would imagine, if we were in the dialogue, we would tell Ion, well, you are an expert on the recitation of the Homeric poems, on the traditional interpretation of what they say. You're not obviously an expert on the different topics that Homer talks about in his poem, but you are an expert on maybe the aesthetic appeal that a poem may have, on the instruments that can be used in a recitation to make a poem even more aesthetically pleasing, on the interpretation of dark aspects of the language in which the poem is composed. But this is not the path followed by Ion. This is not the path followed by Socrates. As I say, Ion implicitly accepts that conflation that Socrates has made at the beginning of the dialogue between being an expert in a poem or a poet and being an expert on the areas that a poem or a poet talks about. So because he is trapped within those constraints, he has to accept that indeed only experts can speak well of their areas of expertise, and the rhapsode does not seem to be an expert on anything. The rhapsode is not an expert in warfare. The rhapsode is not an expert on fishing. The rhapsode is not an expert in divination. So Ion tries to wiggle his way out, and the way he does it is he says that the rhapsode knows what words are the adequate ones for each occasion. And this feels as a pretty weak argument, but I think you could probably rephrase it in a more convincing way as something like, the rhapsode knows works of fiction, and he knows what characters are supposed to say in a work of fiction to both match verisimilitude and the expectations of verisimilitude of the audience, but also to create an aesthetic effect. And you would continue here perhaps by quoting with Aristotle's Poetics and his idea that fiction creates things that are mimetic, that are believable, realistic, and so on and so forth. the words that fit the occasion, again, this attempt at wiggling out does not succeed because, again, Socrates hammers in, so you know the words that are adequate for the occasion. So you know the words of a captain of a ship when a ship is in the middle of a tempest. It says, well, obviously no. It says, okay, well, then you know the words that a slave should say when he is, a cowherd slave, and he has to deal with an unruly herd. You know the technical words that the cowherd slave uses for getting the cows to behave, and says, no. It says, okay, then maybe you know the words of a general. And here, Ion says, yeah, that's a good model. A rhapsode is like a general. And again, what Ion is probably thinking about here is, generals in ancient Greece have to be very good at using words effectively, at seducing their audience, at convincing the soldiers to advance, at convincing the soldiers not to retreat. So he latches upon this and he says, okay, the rhapsode is a general. And of course, Socrates is merciless at, making fun of Ion about this and saying, okay, well, Greek cities need a lot of generals, so you should sell your services out as a general more than as a rhapsode. And well, there is a bit of fun at the expense of Ion at this. So Ion as the best general of Greece, and they get into a brief discussion of should Athens hire you? Well, no, Athens doesn't hire foreigners, and Socrates says no, Athens actually does hire a lot of foreigners for its military commands. So Ion no longer has any place to escape, and Socrates complains that he is not giving satisfactory solutions, and presents him with an ultimatum: either you demonstrate that you really have a knowledge, an ability to speak well about Homer, or you recognize the thesis that I've been pushing since the beginning, that you're really clueless, you don't have any real knowledge about poetry or about Homer, it's just divine inspiration. And Ion surrenders. He says, okay, yeah, he admits that it's divine inspiration that makes him an expert in the area. And that's the dialogue. As I said, this idea that poets are just following divine inspiration and therefore not to be appreciated much is pretty, I would say it's relatively controversial in 5th century Athens, but it matches very well Plato's push for philosophy and against other alternatives. Now, the main alternative or rival of philosophy for the Greek classical education after the 5th century was not poetry, but it was rhetoric. And rhetoric in many ways is poetic. It's, it's using language seductively, using the rhetorical figures of language for getting your audience to do as you like. And, you can see this tension in all through the Greco-Roman period, between this antagonism between the philosophers and the rhetors, on which should be the basis of the education of the citizen. Should the citizen follow philosophy and learn how to think rightly and how to behave morally, or should the basis for education be about rhetoric, about the ability of speaking seductively in public and being able to persuade others to listen to you? But anyway, that's a subject for another day. This was the content of the Ion.